My name is Robin Givon, and I'm the author of The Battle of Versailles, the night American fashion stumbled into the spotlight and made history, and there it is. There it is. And I wanted to just start by giving you a little bit of context and background about this event, and then read a little bit from the book, and then talk to Pat about her experience, because I should give you a spoiler alert that in this Battle of Versailles, which had 5 American and 5 French designers on the same stage, it was the models who were, in many ways, more dynamic than the designers. Which sometimes is the case still, but that's beside the point, no. But this was 1973, and it was a very different kind of fashion industry from the one that exists today. And by that, I mean that the French really dominated. And we talk a lot today about the idea of copying, of knockoffs, of how outrageous that is, and designers get very up in arms about that. But there was a period in American fashion history when copying was not only the norm, it was very formalized, and it was expected. And so many American designers began their careers working in the back rooms of manufacturers, and their job was to copy what came down the runways in Paris. And the process was, as I said, quite formal. And stores would pay a fee, sort of a security deposit, in order to be allowed to go and look at these collections and then bring home the designs that they liked and reproduce them for their clients in varying degrees of quality and in varying degrees of precision. So the farther away you got from Paris, the less expensive the dress became. And sometimes the less quality you got as well. But there was the great Eleanor Lambert, who was one part P.T. Barnum, one part dictator, and one part patriot. And she loved fashion. And she really believed that American design should be on par with French design. And so it was really her idea to have this charity fashion show in which French designers would invite their American counterparts to come and to perform on the same stage. And the French designers, for anyone who doesn't know, were Yves Saint Laurent, Hubert de Givenchy, Pierre Cardin, Emmanuel Ungaro, and Marc Bohan for Christian Dior. A pretty impressive group. The Americans were a bit of a more motley crew. It was Oscar de la Renta and Bill Blass who were sort of the champions of American fashion. But there was also Halston, who really launched us on this path of sort of celebrity designers. There was Anne Klein, the only woman. She was the least wanted at the event. She also happened to have one of the most successful of all the American businesses. And she was really designing clothes for professional women, but with style. And then there was Stephen Burrows, who was young, dynamic. He was buzzy and talented, and he was inspired less by Paris and more by the experiences that he was having in his own life. Dance with his friends, going to Fire Island. He was really an expression of the 1970s and what was happening on the street. And those were the 5 designers who also just happened to be Eleanor Lambert's clients, because she was a very savvy woman. And they didn't have a lot of money, and they agreed that they would have to have at least 3 designers agree on a particular model, and then that model would be able to go to Versailles, and they would all share models. which, again, today seems almost unheard of. And what was really extraordinary, I think, about that particular time was so much was going on culturally that just allowed these things to happen. Women were moving into the workforce. Disco was sort of ascendant. Sexual freedom was really starting to be embraced by a wide variety of people. There was so much more body consciousness, and there was also still a very deeply rooted sense of pride in American style and American fashion and what it could possibly be. And there were also changes in race relations that were bubbling up. And there were tensions, but there were also expressions of joy as well. And I think all of those things really came together to create this particularly ripe moment for American fashion to shine. There also were 5 very strong designer personalities on the American side, and my favorite little detail was that apparently Halston kept referring to himself in the third person, which everyone loves it when someone refers to themselves in the third person. And he also invited his good friend Liza Minnelli to perform for the American portion of the show. And just to give you a little sense of the tension between these designers, Halston was being very cagey about exactly what Liza was going to be doing, and Oscar was not amused. And so Oscar, got wind of this notion that Liza was going to perform in Halston's segment of this show. So Oscar decided that he would call his good friend Raquel Welch and see if Raquel could come from Spain, where she was working, and walk in his show. And then Liza got wind of this. And Liza said, well, listen, I'm going to be up there on stage singing my heart out. And she is fresh off of an Oscar for Cabaret, so you would think she had a lot of confidence. But she said, and then Raquel's going to walk out there, and she's just going to be Raquel in all of her Raquel-ness. And no one's even going to remember what I did. So after some back and forth, the designers agreed that Liza would be the single celebrity, and she would be the thread that linked all this together. And I will also ask Pat to talk a little bit about this in a moment, but one of the great difficulties and one of the strongest memories that so many of the models had was how uncomfortable it was at Versailles as they prepared for the show. And that it was cold and there wasn't food and there wasn't water, there wasn't even toilet paper. And what I learned as I was reporting this was also that, for as difficult as it was for the Americans and as insecure as the Americans were, the French were also very nervous because they were working with a full orchestra. They had ballet dancers and strippers from the Crazy Horse, and they had drag queens, and they had poets, and they had actresses. They had this enormous production, and they were starting to feel like they had really bitten off a lot more than they can chew. And so when the Americans recalled that they were not getting very much rehearsal time on stage, they were certain that it was a French plot to just destroy their production. And the reality was that the French production was in such a mess that they needed all the rehearsal time they could get. So there was a little bit of, I think, self-absorption on both sides and fretting on both sides. But the Americans did have a secret weapon, and that was their models. And of 36 models, 10 of them were African American, which was really surprising then and would be surprising now. And those models were extraordinary in the way that they moved, the way that they brought these clothes to life. And in particular, what was so extraordinary is the fact, if you looked at a lot of these clothes on a hanger, they didn't look like much of anything. You know, I mean, Stephen Burrows loved Jersey. And when I say Jersey, I don't mean sort of the heavier Jersey of today that can sort of hide a lot of sins and smooth out things, that sort of glorified Spanx on your body. This was really light Jersey that hid nothing. So your clothes were not helping you. You had to bring it all on your own. And the models were really able to bring that to life. And the same was true with Halston's work. And, you know, and Oscar, you know, was not showing these sort of, you know, luncheon suits and these constructed evening gowns. A lot of the things that he was showing were these very sensuous, drapey, caftan-like dresses. And so again, there wasn't a lot of structure. The models, the women in those clothes really had to give those clothes relevance and give them their place. So I just want to read a little bit about the show itself. The evening of Wednesday, November 28th, 1973, as guests began arriving at Versailles, the palace glowed under a full moon and through a scrim of light snow, the first dusting of the season. Red uniformed, saber-wielding gendarmes flanked the gilded palace gates, along with some 100 footmen in 18th century white powdered wigs and livery. Marie-Helene de Rothschild, the evening's chairperson, was dressed in a green ostrich-trimmed gown by Yves Saint Laurent, and with solitary diamonds pinned in her thick hair. She greeted guests, brushing kisses on the cheeks of the Americans, on the cheeks of the French, and offering handshakes to the Americans. "You'd never seen anything more beautiful in your life," recalled Tom Fallon, Bill Blass's right-hand man. The pale blue invitations with gold script announced that the Grand Divertissement à Versailles, don't you love my French accent, was to begin promptly at 9 p.m. It also prescribed black tie for men and long gowns for women. Guests expected the Versailles Gala to be another in a series of notable parties of the era that they'd all attended. Truman Capote's black and white ball in New York, the Proust Ball, the Oriental Ball. The Versailles Gala was, of course, a charity event, but mostly it was old friends gathering for a deliciously decadent evening. There were such jewels, recalled Donna Karen, who was Anne Klein's assistant. There were jewels on top of jewels and tiaras on top of tiaras, and scattered discreetly through the crowd were security guards, keeping a watchful eye over the many millions of dollars worth of precious gems tucked into glistening cleavage and pinned into skyward bouffant. For the American designers, walking to their private boxes to watch the show felt like entering the Colosseum to be devoured by the lions. The Grand Divertissement à Versailles had not been organized as a competition, but through the media attention and human nature, it had become just that. The American designers, who'd agreed to the show because it promised to bring them publicity, now just wanted to survive it with their dignity intact. They'd spent days fighting with each other and wrestling with sets and music and choreography that were still in disarray. They'd booked their models on the cheap. Would the young women have enough stage presence to bring the clothes to life? Their music was canned. Would everyone be able to hit their mark? The American designers had gotten the gist of what the French had planned. It was going to be big. It was going to be sweeping, and it would carry the weight of tradition. But while the Americans worried they'd be dwarfed by the French spectacle, the French, who'd been expecting to easily dazzle and then gloat, began to worry that they'd overreached. As the 720 ticket holders and representatives of the French state settled into their seats, Rothschild appeared from behind the royal blue stage curtain, the ones with gold fleur-de-lis designs, to announce that the evening had netted more than $280,000, an amount akin to $1.5 million today. Entertainers will often talk about the perils of being over-rehearsed, that it purges any sense of spontaneity and serendipity from a performance. The Americans had nothing to worry about. Their dress rehearsal had been cursory at best. Liza Minnelli, wearing Halston's gray, wide-leg trousers and camel turtleneck, with a red sweater draped around her neck and a fedora atop her head, pep-talked the models towards confidence for the opening number. "Okay, I'm gonna run out on stage and hit the first note, and you run out behind me," Minnelli told the models. "The more natural it looks, the better, just like people on the street seeing the Eiffel Tower for the first time. Tap each other on the shoulder. You're not modeling, you're acting. Make it look as natural as possible." The models trotted out after her in a panoply of quintessential American sportswear, contributed from all the designers, all in shades of beige. Peacoats, trench coats, pleated skirts, pullover sweaters, shirtwaist dresses with their collars popped, easy trousers and hats, broad brim, tipped to the side, pulled snug over their ears. The only backdrop was the artist Joe Eula's last-minute sketch of the Eiffel Tower. As Minnelli hit the final notes, Fallon heard the audience applaud. He heard cheers. Minnelli came running backstage. "My God," she exclaimed, "we got them." Now the trick was not to lose them. Anne Klein was up first. The designer put model Barbara Jackson in a beige leotard with cap sleeves, little more than a bathing suit, really. She had me lead the group of models downstage. She wanted me to run down towards the audience, and then she said, "Kick your leg up." She wanted people to just see all legs, recalled Jackson. I wasn't as flamboyant as Pat or Billy. I had a little funky quality to my walk. I would come out with a big grin on my face, just happy to be there. I was really happy to be there. Ebony Fashion Fair was my training ground, and it was more entertainment and not just showing fashion. You just wanted to walk to the beat of the music and flip your hair. It was quite a start for the Americans. Klein's so-called Africa collection included black shirts and pleated skirts with abstracted elephant prints, jalabas and loose-fitting shirt dresses, and sexy two-piece dresses with coordinating turbans. While the French models had moved with regal, self-conscious slowness, hands on hips, making precise pivot turns, the Americans were moving to the rhythm of pre-recorded contemporary music. Klein used the soundtrack from Scorpio Rising, a 1963 cult film about gay Nazi biker culture that incorporated early rock and roll music to tell its story. The music included songs by Elvis Presley and Martha Reeves and the Vandellas and Ray Charles, artists embedded in our popular culture. Kay Thompson, the choreographer, had insisted that the models move at top speed. Zoom, 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 1, 2, 3. It was completely different from any kind of show, recalled someone who was there. Originally, each designer had planned to show 70-odd looks, but Bill Blass had forcefully argued for ruthless editing. Still, even with only about 20 garments each, that was at least 100 entrances, and the models had to make whiplash-fast changes with the help of a few assistants. The backstage was expansive, but it was crowded and dark. Between the French and the Americans, there were close to 300 people backstage. Donna Karan was backstage. She was helping to dress Anne Klein's models, and she was feeling so much stress that she started to have pre-labor contractions. In particular, she had to get Billy Blair out of one garment and into the next, pronto. She walked off with one arm still on stage, and I was dressing the other arm, Karen recalled. Literally, half of me was being undressed and half was dressed, Blair said. Things move so quickly when you finished a passage, right off stage, they're standing there with the next garment. There were no zippers, Karen said. You pulled the clothes on. It only worked because the clothes were simple. Unlike the French styles, with elaborate hooks and eyes that practically required a lady-in-waiting to fasten, the American clothes were designed for a quick-moving, independent woman. This was fashion's future in the wings of the Theatre Gabriel, a woman getting dressed fast and furiously. And And I will just give you a spoiler alert. The Americans won. It was spectacular. And I really wanted Pat to be here because she was there, she was on that stage. And first I'm hoping you can just give us all a little bit of context of what it was like for you to be a model at that time, because you were not an unknown, you had a career, you had a reputation, and so this must have seemed like a pretty scattered, disorganized, sketchy project that you've gotten yourself into.
Anything for America. I was living in Paris at the time, and they said, "Do you want to come back and do a show with everybody?" "What kind of show?" "You get to sing and dance." And I said, "Oh, yes, we're in." And all of us girls who love singing and dancing thought, this is our chance. So, of course, all the black girls knew how to move it and groove it, and all the other girls, too, all the American girls. The Halston girls, the Bill Blass girls.
When I talked to you for the book, I asked you a little bit about what inspired your style of movement on the runway. And you talked about dance and Katherine Dunham.
Well, yeah, Katherine Dunham, African-American dancing. Everybody used to dance with her. Eartha Kitt, Marlon Brando. When I was 5 years old, I was their little mascot hanging off the bar. But, you know, all of that comes in handy. All your growing up, and all of these girls that were in the show had these dreams of going to Paris, and some of them had never been there before. So when they reached Paris to get off the plane, and they kissed the ground. I'm in Paris, chérie. And, you know, my style is just pretty much of the time. I think the music, get on up and get on the good foot, and everything to do with being and feeling good was the American way.
But it was really quite dynamic and quite different, because in talking to women who had, you know, gone to couture shows, one of them described sitting at a Balenciaga show and sitting in silence, that it was like high church.
Well, it was a very private world. Fashion was shown on living models in a salon, where you were quiet because the ladies were having tea there and being romanced by the designers. In a quiet atmosphere, there would be maybe 5 or 6 ladies sitting in a circle, and then you'd have to come out with a little number and show that. And that was something that I used to do in the beginning. But then 1970 came, and Stephen Burrows and all the colors and all the freedom with the garments. You didn't have all of those undergarments, no zippers, no buttons, no bows, just you let it slide down on your body like a flag. You know, we were the flagpoles and the clothes were the flags. And so we let those clothes slide down, and we felt absolutely free. You know, it's like when the pantyhose came out. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, something like that. So we wore those clothes with a lot of pride, because we knew they were cut on the bias and they were very free-flowing, and we had to bring that. We had to show that feeling. And America and the 70s and the pop art and Andy Warhol and Halston, all of these, you know, Stephen, it was something so different from France, from Paris, you know. So away with the numbers, no holding numero uno. C'est cinq, numero cinq. I always had that number when I came out. Numero cinq. And they would announce it. There would always be an announcer. No announcers, just music and movement.
I was always curious when you were on the stage at Versailles, and they didn't build a catwalk out into the audience. It was a proscenium stage, so it was from left to right. Could you see the audience as you were on stage and twirling and spinning and...
Well, it's like being a blind person, really. When you're on the runway, you have eyes in the bottom of your feet, basically, because the spotlight is so bright that it just blinds you. So what you see basically is darkness. You see a pit of darkness, and you pray all the way to the end. And usually when I'm spinning, I almost fall off the stage every time, and then it's like, oh, the edge, go back. So happy to turn back because I knew I didn't fall off.
Tom Fallon described such a spectacular moment where Pat started spinning. She was still backstage. And she came out onto the stage and she was just spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. And she came as close as possible to the edge of the stage and stopped. And it was like some sort of gymnastics triumph where she just stuck her landing. And, you just wanted to hold up 10, tens.
Dancing with the Stars.
But could you sense in the moment the way that the audience was reacting, or was it just still a kind of, I hope we're doing okay,
Well,
I hope
it's
we're getting this
do
right?
or die. If you don't do it in that moment, you see, the advantage we had then was not a lot of judgment backstage because there were no video cameras or anything. So when you went out on that stage, it was your show. So your show means do your very best. And the very best for me is showing the garment. What does it have to offer? How many thousands of layers of chiffon can you wear at once? And for me, this dress that I wore at Versailles had hundreds of layers, literally hundreds of layers of beige chiffon, so I would turn like a moth until the flame got me. That means it's time to get off. But anyway, that's the flame. Oh no, I have to leave. Oh, I want to stay out here forever. So those clothes, they made our spirit rise. And every single girl wanted to do their best. And especially we 7th Avenue models, we call ourselves. There were walking girls and there were photography girls. But we were the walkers because we did it every day for a living. We were on 7th Avenue parading around in those clothes. They belonged to us. They were our own clothes. We belonged to them and they belonged to us. So, it was our job.
For the designers, they talked about, sort of coming back to the States, and, there was no ticker tape parade, there were no giant stories on the front pages of newspapers. Women's wear covered it, certainly, and there were smaller stories in newspapers, but it was, in many ways, covered like a society event. And so people have asked me, what was the impact of Versailles for the designers? And, I do believe that for the designers who participated, it was sort of a psychic boost. They felt prouder of themselves and they felt a bit more confident. But I don't think you really see the impact until you get to the generations that followed those designers. I mean, Stephen Burrows said he didn't even tell his mother about the success at Versailles. And I'm just wondering, did Versailles have an impact on your career? Did it change its trajectory at all, or was the trajectory already upward and it just sort of kept going where it was going?
What it did was it brought a family together, the American family of designers. But really, in truth, all the designers really loved each other, but they're all very competitive in the end. Like, I want all the attention, all the French ones. I want to be the best, even amongst themselves.
They were all frenemies. I said they were frenemies.
Frenemies, yeah. They all love each other and hate each other. And when the day is over, they do want to party together. And before you know it, they're sitting at each other's table and drinking out of each other's glasses and falling on each other's laps. So it's not so bad. But the battle is that America's on one side of the ocean and Europe is on the other. And that's old world and this is new world. So, young people, new designs, new opportunities. We don't need to follow the old ways. And now the reason this book is so important is that it gives hope to young people because they know they can go and conquer. And, the Battle of Versailles, that is what you need to do. You need to be a conqueror when you go out there. So it's about attitude.
One of the things that Bill Blass had noted before he died in a story was he sort of said that, if he had one regret, it was that he had not been trained in couture, that he didn't have that in his background. And, in hindsight, I thought it was a really interesting thing for him to say because I think the designers of his generation really, they felt very profoundly the footprint of Paris on the fashion world. And that footprint is still there, but when I talk to younger designers, I have never heard a younger designer lament that he or she was not trained in couture. I've never heard a younger designer sort of talk about this pressure that fashion comes from Paris and that that's something that they have to fight through. I think they feel very strong about their American roots.
They do feel strong, patriotic and business-wise. The big patenting of your name and the branding and all is very important now. Okay, you have a name,
Perhaps
it's a
too
brand.
important.
But that wasn't existing then. People felt they needed to be couture because couture is a bias cut on life. The most expensive fabrics, the best workers. You go into a fashion house like a Valentino, and the workers are religiously sewing. They do these stitches on paper, and if the paper tears, then you have not learned your lesson. So it's a particular kind of work, like being an artisan. There are so many artisans, in that world of couture, whereas they come to America, and you'll find a few of them here now, too. Yeah. And it's very important to carry that art. It's like learning to paint oils. You need teachers. Couture is the teacher of designers. You need couture because it's an old world working by hand.
And one of the last things I wanted to ask you about before we open for questions is, as you look back on your time in the 70s as a model, which really felt like such a wonderful time for American models, and you have a daughter now who's doing extraordinarily well.
She's in Paris.
In the world of modeling. What do you see now as opportunities that are available to her that might not have been available to you?
Well, this story about what's available now is more public. So she has film, the internet. You have a name. Before, there was no name to the model, and you become a brand, actually. You become a brand. And in those days, you become a muse, which means you are silently somewhere existing in the ethers, floating around in someone's atelier, and being very proud of that because you're in the presence of a great artist working. You have to be very quiet and very, respectful. And now people think, oh, I'm going to model, and they come from all over the world and give me the money. I want money now. I owned a model agency for 20 years, and I'll tell you that I've seen them coming and going from age 15 to 50. And, things change with the desires of the public and the politics. It's all political. And who's coming in and who's going out. So I think we're just going to see many more types of people with maybe even more opportunities, but it's all about communications. That's the difference now. There's more about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the model has a voice.
Absolutely. And I know I've met many girls who come from places like Nigeria and places in Africa where they start schools because they have the platform to change the world. So I think it's very diplomatic thing. You're in the model diplomatic corps at some point because you can represent something more than yourself.
Well, I know we would both love it if you guys have questions or one or two. Yes, sir. You're first.
Hello. A couple years ago, I did my master's thesis based on black models, and when I was doing my research, I came across the Battle of Versailles, although I was a fashion student many years ago and knew nothing of it, actually during the 70s. And then I intentionally went through and looked through I wrote a paper on doing my research for Versailles, and looked through a few fashion history books, and there's either nothing said or very little said. So do you have any idea why this wonderful event happened that was not, that knowledge wasn't passed on, and particularly because it did so much for black models, why that hasn't generated any interest or?
You know, I found, when I was doing the research, I would say that I found stories in, you know, most of the major papers. I mean, there were stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times. There were stories in the Christian Science Monitor, in, I believe, one of the Chicago papers. But, for instance, the New York Times story was not written by Bernardine Morris. It was written by Enid Nemi. And Enid was not a fashion writer. She covered society, and she covered parties, and she covered sort of that world of sort of jet setters and things like that. And you know, the story that ran in the Washington Post was not written by Nina Hyde, who was the fashion editor at that time. It was written by a correspondent in France, and a good chunk of the story was given over to why on earth is Versailles doing this incredible event in the middle of an oil crisis. So, you know, I think part of the reason was because in many ways it was seen as a social charity event, and the only place that really covered it as pure fashion or really sort of captured a lot of the subtext of it and the meaning of it was Women's Wear Daily. The rest of the paper saw it as something else. So I think in part that was because there was this presumption that it was just another big party and that there was really not going to be much that came out of it. And you know, I had the chance to talk to one journalist who had been there, who was writing for UPI, which was one of the wire services at the time. And she had said that she was so startled that it was something that she wasn't expecting, that she sort of raced back to her hotel to write her story, but her story was only, you know, about that long. So I do think it was, for those reasons, sort of a bit of lost history. I think it was a bit of lost history because when the designers came back, they didn't really talk about it very much, aside from Halston, who, you know, liked to talk about Halston in sort of his wonderful way. But the others just sort of came back and got back to work. I asked Oscar de la Renta what happened to the collection that he showed at Versailles. He had no recollection because at that time, many designers did not keep an archive. You know, they're now in the process of going back and trying to buy many of their signature pieces via eBay or auctions and things like that. So I think, you know, just sort of belabor the point, I think there was just this kind of lack of a clear understanding in the moment of what it might represent 20 or 30 years later. I think sometimes you don't realize the resonance of something until it's long over and you look back with the benefit of a little bit of distance. But you're right. I mean, there were not these great, long, wonderful stories. And, you know, the Vogue coverage, for instance, and Grace Mirabella was there. You know, it was maybe 2 or 3 pages, and it was mostly, you know, a few large pictures and a little bit of copy. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Well, we actually both teach ethnic fashion, and between your book, giving it to students, and showing them the documentary, I almost want to cry because so many African American students now, they started crying, and it's, you know.
Can I say
Wait
something?
a minute.
Yeah, the black girls.
Between
black
you
girls.
and then to see you in Scatter My Ashes at Bergdorf, they screamed, "There she is again!" And then you being a no, seriously, and you being a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, I just can't tell you what you did, what you both have done.
I use her book for reference. Was I there? Yeah, that really happened. She got that right.
It's so true. what
She
you
did
said.
get it right,
They
you
don't
know?
know, and it's not in any books. We teach at 2- and 4-year schools, so what you guys have done is amazing.
Well, the thing about the girls, you know, the black girls were always there in the ateliers being pinned. They got the most pins. And the designers love them because they can move, like to the music and had a reason to live. They weren't blasé, and they had a new style, funky, So that kind of like that movement and the body form, it's very Picasso-like. It's just a beautiful African standing in front of you like a tree. It's a gorgeous thing.
Do we have time for? Okay. Oh. Well, Pat, please jump in if you know something that I don't. I looked tirelessly for film, and I know there was a small clip that was shown on the nightly news with what's his name, Walter Cronkite. And at one point, Monsanto, which was one of the underwriters for the event, had requested that they be allowed to video the rehearsals. And Monsanto also had a few other things written into their contract, things like, the models would have to wear X number of wigs because they produce the synthetic fiber that was used to make these wigs. And they wanted that to be sure that the models wore X number of wigs and this, that, and the other thing. And there was a fabulous memo from Eleanor Lambert tucked into her papers at FIT in which she responded to Monsanto and said, well, this is really not a corporate public relations event unless I've somehow misunderstood. So I think Eleanor sort of tamped that down a little bit. And Oscar de la Renta had thought that there had been a video made, and he also had gone on the hunt for it, thinking that it was something that might be in the Rothschild archives, and he was not able to find it. And Marie-Helene also was quite strict, and who was invited and who was allowed to photograph it and so forth. So as far as I know, there is no existing video of the entire event. The documentary shows clips from the nightly news, and there's also
One little piece of voguing at the end.
yeah. And then there's Pat, and there's all the models that are talking, but there's not like the extensive video from the show.
You need the book. You really need you need the book for reference.
Can I just, one other little thing about the book is that there are two photo inserts, and one of them is an insert of photographs by Bill Cunningham, who was there and who photographed it. And I'm just really proud and thrilled that he allowed me to include his photos in the book. And they're magical because he's backstage and he's up close, and they're just gorgeous photos.
Hi.
I want to thank you.
Some
One more question. Sorry.
Yeah, just wasn't there some commentary afterwards about the French sort of saying, the Americans really wiped us out with their casual sass and wonderful presentation. I had heard that from Bill Blass myself, that Americans really...
Yeah, the French response was a recognition that the Americans had just put on a better show, that it had the excitement and the and the modernity of like a Broadway production. There was a little bit of a backhanded compliment when the French sort of said, well, and I think this was from Pierre Berger, where he said, well, the clothes weren't that great, but the models and the production were spectacular.
Well, what a great way to end. And thank you so much.